All right, everyone. Welcome back to Cranked and Ranked. This is episode 2 of our Slayer discography ranking. Hopefully you listened to part 1 first and are now joining us over here. If for some reason you wanted to skip ahead to the top 6 albums and you're new to this thing, I'm Steven, and my friend Eddie and I rank rock and metal related things, bands, discographies, and whatnot. This is it. You're listening to it. This is like the worst intro I think I've ever done.
It's all good. It's all good, dude. Just
so
they don't know it yet. It's all good.
Obviously, maybe it wasn't meant to be. Maybe the intro is not meant to be, and we should just jump right in. So last time we ranked. We're doing all the full length Slayer releases, and we did 12 through 7 last time, and so now we are doing 6 through numero uno, as they say in certain areas of the world. As usual, I'm going to let my friend Eddie Sparxx go first. If you want to say a few words before you start, please be my guest. But let's get into your number 6.
Okay, cool. I wanted to mention as well, I recently went back, and I know we haven't included it in this list, but I checked out Haunting the Chapel, which is like, it's 4 studio tracks and mostly a live album. But the song Chemical Warfare from that album was on this, again, generational comment. That song was on Guitar Hero Warriors of Rock, and playing that on the drum kit, taught me how to do the Slayer beat.
Oh, okay.
On drums.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a fun little. I had no idea that he was like. This was one of the first things that blew my mind about Slayer, was how fast the hi-hat notes were.
Yeah.
So when I saw this like flurry of like little yellow circles coming down that grid, I just thought, holy fuck. I was under the impression that he was just like alternating between the right and left, when in actual fact, no, it's just like a constant and that was a big crash course into thrash drumming.
Yeah. And that's a great EP too. And I guess the problem is when we're dealing with larger discographies, we got to leave some things out, and so it's easy to just be like, oh, this is an EP, we won't really touch on it. But yeah, it is some classic shit, especially Chemical Warfare.
Yeah. So on that note, I'm going to go into number 6.
Alrighty.
And my number 6 pick is, now it's changed in, like, it was number 5.
Okay.
But it has changed over the week with, like, listening to the other albums and stuff, and I've really been analyzing stuff and really nitpicking, and I've gone for number 6 with Show No Mercy.
Okay,
so like the big thing I noticed right off of the bat with this album, it has like it's got a lot of low end in the mix, considering it's an early 80s thrash album. Now, when you compare this album to Kill 'Em All, it essentially just sounds like a much bassier, albeit faster and, heavier as it is Slayer, but it still has that kind of like new wave of British heavy metal influence and things like that, and all sorts. But you can really hear, I think this is the album with the most prominent bass. Tom is really audible on this album, especially in like the intro to Black Magic. But yeah. I'll get to that one in a minute.
That's in juxtaposition to what we were talking about last episode, where it seems like on a lot of Slayer albums, Tom Araya's bass seems to be buried very low in the mix. Like sometimes I can't even pick it out in certain songs on certain albums, and other times it's just very low. But you are right. In this particular album, you can hear it clear as day.
Yeah, and it's such a it's such a weird little thing I picked up on, because not a lot of early 80s mixes, as far as I know, were that bassy, you know?
Yeah.
A lot of them were very, you know, MIDI and trebly, whereas this has a really cool, punchy, dark sound considering the time it came out in.
And you would
1983.
You would wonder, like, if that was intentional or not. Like, was it an error? Like, was the production not exactly what they wanted, and it just so happened that the bass was louder? But I guess, you know, we'd have to ask them. But either way, you know, it does. You know, overall, though, it does have a very classic metal kind of sound to it, but the bass is an interesting character.
Yeah, it's got like remnants of the bands that came before, with some, like, you know, catchy hooky parts in there, but still much more extreme than those bands right off of the bat. You know, with Evil Has No Boundaries introduces us to Slayer's vicious breed of 80s thrash, you know, complete with the occasional, like, high scream that would become rarer and rarer with each ensuing release. I think the last time he actually did that, like, kind of thing was on Angel of Death. I can't think of any others where he, like, did that really high up shriek. He
does it a couple times on the Rain and Blood album. But yeah, post that album, I think he pretty much just ditched that.
Yeah, which, you know, I suppose as you do get older, certain notes get harder to hit if you're not, like, classically trained or something, which, you know, quite obviously Tom was not. Tom was just, I'm going to get up and I'm going to and just be the gnarliest guy in town.
Also, I think that as they were developing their sound as what would become, you know, the Slayer sound, I feel like that way of doing that one vocal part, it's almost like that was an old trope from the days of the past, and it wasn't a Slayer thing. It was almost like that was an element that they didn't even need, and he was doing it for whatever reason. Because it always kind of, some bands, when they do that, it always kind of catches me off guard, because if the majority of their vocals are not like that, and then just one word they decide to go, I'm just like, well, why?
Yeah.
Why? And it's almost like they feel like they need to. And then Slayer decided, you know what? We don't need to. And I'm sure Tom Araya was like, great. Fuck that shit.
I think there's one in Necrophobic.
Yeah. The very last, he's singing all fucking fast.
Brilliant. But yeah, I'll get to that song later.
Yep.
So we have track 2, The Antichrist, is one of the catchiest songs they've ever written. You know, this one almost reminds me a little bit of Jump in the Fire. It's got that real hooky element to it, especially right off the bat as well. It's got that and it almost doesn't sound like them, but when it comes in with the main verse, and it becomes a Slayer song. But much like this album, this is Slayer becoming Slayer. You know, you've still got influences left over, which becomes gradually more apparent as the album progresses, as I'd noticed. Die by the Sword carries the same vibe as the opening track, although Tom sounds less vicious and more like he's straining to hit the notes on this one. But there is an awesome mid-tempo breakdown in the middle, though. And Fight Till Death is another early thrash song on here, though still clearly displaying a less refined and more new wave of British heavy metal influence sound than the pioneering kind of extreme thrash sound that they would develop as the decade progressed. And then I think this is one of those times where when you hit the middle of the album, the best material is like dead center in the album, because you've got the pairing of, you know, Metal Storm, Face the Slayer. You know, that lead guitar intro is amazing, and following that one up with Black Magic, which in my opinion has to be one of, if not the best song Slayer has written, because I love everything about it.
Yeah.
All of the various parts are amazing, and it doesn't falter at any point during the song.
I think we fanboyed over that one in the last episode too, a little bit.
Yeah. I just fucking love Black Magic. I get goosebumps with that song. It's so good.
Yeah, it's really like for that particular album, that's the standout track for me. That's the one that you can't just discard that album as just a debut where they're figuring out their sound, because in a song like that, I think that's where they're dialing it in, and they're like, okay, I think we know what we're doing now. And so yeah, it's fucking classic.
Definitely. And then you get to what I would refer to as the Maiden section of the record.
Yeah.
Where they kind of, it's like they hit the mark on Black Magic, and then they were like, okay, here is all now that we've ripped your face off with, that gradual climb up to the climax that is Black Magic, they were going to show off some of their influences a little more. So right off the bat, Tormentor could have been a Maiden song. The only thing reminiscent of straight up Slayer is the solo, and it's interesting to think about what it would be like if Slayer went down a more traditional, like, Maiden Judas Priest kind of route. Because I think this album, they could have gone one of two ways. They obviously went in the more extreme direction, but can you imagine if Slayer went down a more, not so much softer, but more accessible route?
Yeah, I mean, that would have definitely been interesting. I feel like they could have pulled it off, but
yeah,
I don't think we would be talking about them in the same respect that we are now if they had done that. They would just be another great metal band from the 80s, but I don't think that they would have defined, a genre, been one of the genre-defining bands.
Oh, definitely, for sure. And then Final Command also has that vibe until they go full speed metal. And then Cryonics has this mega new wave British heavy metal vibe too. There's a big chunk of, like, not necessarily thrash, but classic early 80s metal at the end of, at this end portion of the record. And then Show No Mercy, the title track, rips your face off. It's a fucking thrasher. And then all in all, a top half album for me, but they have yet to, fully hone in on what they would become. So this is kind of like, this is Slayer figuring out who they are.
Yeah, and you kind of have to remember that I think a lot of bands, especially around that time, well, maybe even today too, but especially back in the days of getting record deals and putting out albums, that, if you had just figured out your sound and you have, 4 or 5 kick-ass tight songs and you got to record an album, then you're like, well, we have these other ones we have to throw on here too. So I think that's why that album isn't as great, because I think there are some of those, we have these other songs and we need 10 songs or however many songs it is to fill an album.
Yeah.
And so, but I think every band has that. They have to fit in what they have in order to make it a full-length album. And sometimes it's just a bunch of amazing songs, and other times we get to hear the growth of the band, like where they kind of started it off.
And I think that's cool in its own right, because you get to see how a band evolves.
Yeah.
And I think it makes the overall experience more interesting when you have things like that in the mix that make you think, wow, what were they thinking when they made this song, or something like that. I wouldn't want a band to make, I know this is funny coming from Slayer, but in a way they stuck to their guns and had the Slayer sound, but they did evolve.
Yeah.
But I don't want a band to get a sound and then stick with that sound like consistently every single record. I want a little bit of deviation, maybe a strange production style, or, basically just don't make, album part 2 or like, Back in Black 8.
Yeah. which unfortunately, I think that even some of the bands that didn't do that in the past, some of the bands that are still around today, that's kind of what they're doing. They're like, everyone expects us to do this sound, so every 3 years we're going to put out an album produced by the same person with a very similar sound, and the songs, even if they're good songs, they still sound very interchangeable with the 3 or 4 albums they did prior to that, and so it kind of sucks. Definitely. But I guess Slayer, for the most part, didn't really fall into that category overall. Like I wouldn't hold them to that. They have a couple albums that I spoke about on the last episode that I do think sound a bit paint by numbers at times, but I think overall they did manage to give every album kind of its own character, which is admirable for sure. Yeah, and it's very easy to fall into this trap of thinking Slayer is one thing when actually, they aren't. They have explored. They've just explored things in a way, in the Slayer way, in that evil kind of sound. Whether it be ridiculously fast or it be slow and sludgy. I think Slayer, while they have had a consistent. They've had a consistent vibe. The sound of the records has changed over time. Yeah. And so I have rambled on enough for that. It is your turn. That's all right. That's how we roll on this podcast, folks. If you're new to this, it works out very well because Eddie is somebody who takes notes and he goes through the tracks and he seems like he's almost rigorous with his details, which is helpful because I'm more of a feeling and a vibe and a summary kind of guy. So if it was just me here talking, we would be done in 20 minutes, and I'd be like, "All right, guys, later." So this works out because as you'll hear when I talk about my number 6. So my number 6 is Divine Intervention from 1994. Ooh. So. This album, to me, is the last classic Slayer album. And I know some people would argue against that fact because, you don't have Dave Lombardo. I don't know why my brain farted right there. But it's the first album with Paul Bostoff. And the production's not very good. You could make that argument too. I've heard all of that shit, and I agree with it. But for some reason, this album, the overall vibe of it, it just has, like, if you're talking about what we were talking about before, where Slayer was, developing their sound and trying new things, this is like the last, I think, of the classic era of that, before they kind of, I don't know. I mean, because obviously after this, they go into the nu metal territory a little bit, and then things kind of, the trajectory didn't seem the same, if that makes sense. So there are some really great songs on Divine Intervention, a lot of them. One of them that we touched on last episode was Ditto Head. Ditto Head's one of my favorite Slayer songs, and it's just a fucking insane song. But, aside from that, the thing that I think is really great about this album, and it was great when it came out, because there was a lot of hype building up for this album when it came out in 94. And the thing that I loved when I got this album was they still stayed really fucking heavy and for the most part really fast. And this was in 1994, where everybody was slowing down. Everybody was making sort of altered versions of what they were doing. People like to point out, the thrash bands that can do no wrong, like, Exodus. But Exodus put out an album that was pretty toned down for an Exodus album with Force of Habit, which I love that album. But I think out of all of those bands, I think Slayer was the one with this particular album, but they kept going with a lot of those classic Slayer elements, even though they were now making an album in 1994 when music had the face of music had changed, especially metal. So, yeah, the fact that they didn't move away and shy away from still doing some fast, thrashy stuff and some real heavy songs is pretty great. And I don't know, the mostly with this album with me, it's the overall vibe. And, you know, once again, maybe I have to chalk it up a little bit to nostalgia because I remember the album being out and listening to it a lot, and it gives me a nice feeling of what the musical world was like in 1994 and how this album really stood out. And of course, like a lot of albums, this one loses a bit of its steam on the second half. But that's, I don't know. I think that happens a lot, especially with albums in the 90s. But yeah, overall, it just feels like a classic. I listen to it now and it just, like parts of songs will come on and I'll go, yes, that's that fucking killer part from this song. Like it doesn't seem like a newer Slayer album anymore. It seems like a classic Slayer album. And, yeah, it's just a lot of fun to listen to. It's a very enjoyable album. And, as I said before on the last podcast, I do have, issues with some of Paul Bostap's drumming, mostly his double kick playing, because it does seem a little bit clumsy at times, but clearly that might just be a me thing. We'll have to wait. We'll have to wait and get feedback from these episodes and just have people being like, "That guy Steve is a fucking idiot. Paul Bostap rules." But overall, the dude's a fucking killer drummer. I mean, so I don't know. Yeah. Now I feel like I'm just rambling about this album, but to me it fits in the second half for me because it does still have a classic quality and it's still a really great album to listen to today from beginning to end. So there you go, number 6.
I think as well, just to build off what you said about it being like in the classic era. See, I generally consider, like, even if it's a subconscious thing, I tend to think, you know, Show No Mercy right through up to Seasons in the Abyss was like Slayer's golden age.
Yeah.
And obviously Divine Intervention, it did suffer from like production, and obviously the 4-year difference production wise between 1990 and 1994 is huge.
Yeah.
Because like I said in the last episode, the big 80s big reverb thing was still very prominent in the metal thing until about 93. You know, that was still kicking about for a while. You had bands like Helmet that completely ditched that in like 92 and had a really tight sound. And you can really hear the distinct dryness of the 90s production on the record. It's like nowhere near the best production anyway. Like no. even by like 80s standards, you know, they'd be like, hey, those guitars are pretty, you know, murky, and
yeah,
you know, there's not a lot of definition in certain elements of the mix.
And I guess that says a lot about the album too, because if it breaks through that or I was gonna say breaks through that hurdle. No, you're supposed to jump over hurdles, right? I think. So the fact that it gets past that part of the album, and to me it doesn't matter. Like the production never drags the album down to me. Maybe it felt like it did at the time, but getting used to the way that it sounds, all that shines through now is just the songwriting and the performances, and it's, you know, it doesn't matter anymore.
And like you say, it does still have that classic thrash feel to it, even if it does have like a strange production for that kind of era's songwriting. Because if you're so used to 80s Slayer, I know Seasons was 1990, but it still applies.
Yeah,
you know. The 80s weren't officially over until at least 93.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of why the album works for me is because I don't know, if you take the first song, Killing Field, how it starts off with really odd sort of tempo, whatever you call it, time signature kind of thing that's going on during the verses, and then it still kicks in for the thrashy part. So it's almost like it I don't know. It really, that's the thing that's so odd about it, is because even those parts, even the parts where Slayer took an odd turn in a certain part of a song, it still doesn't sound like they were trying to sound 90s. So maybe that's probably why it still sounds classic. It just sounds like a band trying something different, but then still busting out the fast thrashiness when it needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think that pretty much sums up Divine Intervention and Slayer's whole ethos during that time. You know, the production had shifted and they had a different drummer, but they were still going to play thrash. Yeah. You know, they weren't the kind of band that would, I don't want to say like adapt, but because they did, but they didn't falter from what made them unique. Yeah. And I think Slayer has a unique tonality to them that's one of this incredibly heavy, evil sound that you don't really get from any other bands. And I think that could be even down to like the choice of guitar tones and the way everything works like this well-oiled killing machine.
Yeah, totally.
There's so many thrash bands, but I don't think I've ever heard any that can replicate the Slayer sound, even in like even in like covers.
Yeah, there are some others that have that edge that it's very extreme, like like Violence and Devastation and bands like that I think are contenders for being in the same arena, but I really don't think those bands would exist without Slayer anyway. Yeah. So
definitely. Slayer certainly set the bar.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So is that your number 6?
Yes, so now down to your number 5.
Cool. So my number 5 is 2001's God Hates Us All.
All right.
And this one I would consider something of a guilty pleasure, but it's an album that helped me through a bit of a rough time. I'm aware of some of the leftover like nu metal tropes in it, but this album hit me right in the adolescence. So it sounds like how I would have wanted that nu metal sound to be, you know.
So wait, how old were you in 2001?
Oh, well, I would have been 3 in 2001. Okay. But yeah.
For a second there, I was like, wait,
3-year-old me.
Okay, so you didn't hear it at 3. Okay, never mind. I get what you're saying.
Nah, yeah. It was an album that I say came along. It was an album I started listening to around kind of a dark time. And, you know, the angry lyrics came at a time when I was in a dark place and all I wanted to do, you know, I was like peak outcast edgy kid at this point, and all I wanted to do was just get into fights and shit. I never actually did it, but you know, this album was a good outlet for that, inner rage.
That album feels like a fight.
It really, it really does. You know that, and like while the lyrics may seem cringy and like too on the nose at points, I feel as though that they were so direct. They perfectly summed up how I feel at the time, like that kind of punch right in the face kind of feel that you do get from this album.
But they were direct in a way that I don't think it. Maybe there are some cheesy bits here and there, but the fact that this was around the time that we were also doing a lot of these nu metal things, like I think Slipknot lyrics are laughable almost all the time.
Yeah.
And this doesn't come across like that to me, even though it's very direct and I don't know, it never came across as funny. There's funny bits, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah. It seemed like it was of its time. Like that's how things were needed to be said in 2001.
Definitely. Just straight to the point, you know, I'm gonna beat your fucking brains out kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's like the songs like Exile and Payback, you know, really tapped into that part of my brain that just made me want to, go on this fucking one-man rampage.
Yeah. Plus, like, I have to admit, like, I still grin every time he does the payback's a bitch, motherfucker. Like, it makes me smile. And I don't know. I'm probably not supposed to smile there, but it really does. It hits some sort of happy nerve with me where I'm like, oh, that's, I know, right? It's perfect.
Yeah. It's almost like that kind of like evil grin you get from like doing something a little bit, perhaps illegal or frowned upon, but you don't care. But going into the tracks, it starts off with an intro called Darkness of Christ, which I can only assume it is engineered to trick you into turning the album up so that the next song blows you away.
That's an interesting thought. That's a good idea. If nobody's done that, do that shit.
Like, because when you listen to it, it's like it's almost like EQ'd to have no punch. So you're listening to this new album and you're hearing this like muffled version of Slayer, and it's like, God, those drums sound really tinny. And you're like, that was the first track? What the hell's going on here? And then and then Disciple rips your skin off and eats it, and then that song there is not. Would you call it the title track? I suppose, because it does say.
I do. I tend to forget what it's called, and I always call it "God Hates Us All," even though it's not called that. It feels like the title track because the title is in it. But that is a top 10 Slayer song for me too. That's a fucking classic.
Definitely, because I remember the first time I heard this, and it was on the Big Four show DVD, and I was like, Slayer did a song like this, and that's the same reason Jihad is another one of my favorite Slayer songs. And then song God Send Death, switches between classic, speedy Slayer while incorporating that groove element they explored during this time. New Faith has a deliciously brutal chugging guitar tone. Cast Down sounds very Roots era Sepultura, similar to the sound the band used a lot on the previous album. And then here I am at the most guilty pleasure Slayer track in their entire discography for me. I think this was like at number 1 on a list somewhere for like the worst Slayer songs. But I absolutely fucking love it. It's Threshold. Yeah. Threshold is shamelessly nu metal influenced, and it's a 2.5 minute pure edgy anger fest, and I'm not gonna lie, it is probably the biggest guilty pleasure in this entire discography, and especially the groove of that chorus, it's like, the violence, I love it, that kind of thing, and it's like, But that's one thing that I pointed out when I talked about this album is I like the fact that they didn't just completely abandon what they were doing on Diabolus in Musica. Like there's still elements of that on this. And so that makes that album not seem like a fucking waste of time because they didn't just go, oops, sorry. They kept some of those elements for this album. I feel like this is the album that, that one should have been in a way. Like not so much that album shouldn't have happened, but I think Diabolus was like the experiment, and this was the end result. This was the product we managed to get by exploring those sounds on the previous record. And then you've got Exile. It is pure rage, and the line I love the bit where he just goes, "You self-righteous fuck, give me a reason not to rip your fucking face off."
Yeah.
And it's got that kind of head bopping nu metal feel in there mixed with the Slayer thing, but it does it in such a way that, it doesn't feel corny to me. It feels like just a different version of a band I love doing something that's less, Satan oriented and more just let's go out and kill some asshole.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you know, I'm probably going to say some very worrying shit during this segment of the podcast, but I'm actually a very level-headed individual, you know. But it's just this song, these songs during this time, I think, were a big help as to what made me who I am now.
And I think that could be said about a lot of metalheads. Like, I think it's like therapy. We get out the aggression through this music, and I feel like people that don't listen to aggressive music, I think that like that's why they have to shoot guns and shit because they just don't. They have to get it out somehow.
It never ceased to amaze me how, like, you know, back in school, I might have got into like 1 or 2 fights, but I was never one of those like start trouble kids. But I listened to some of the most brutal and violent music of anyone I knew.
Yeah.
And I think that really says a lot about, you know, the effect that aggressive music really has on the listener, because I don't actually feel aggressive. I actually feel a relief from this kind of thing. Yeah. Because it's almost like I don't have to go out and kill this guy because Slayer's going to do it for me. So, yeah. And going back to the tracks, you got 7 Faces. It's a plodding, menacing groover of a track. Bloodline is a tune. No questions asked. Bloodline, I fucking love that one. That chromatic thing. And then the part where they do like the cymbal chokes with the just so good.
Honestly, just to piggyback off of what I was saying before, because I did say I've said negative things about Paul Bostaff's drumming. On God Hates Us All, I think he's pretty spot on the whole fucking time. Like, I don't remember hearing anything on that one where I was like, oh, that could have been done better. So I think he nailed it with that one. And I think he nailed it on a lot of albums too, but I had to give him some props because I feel like I've been harsh to him.
You dogged on him on the Divine Intervention.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really underrated record. I think it's definitely the best of their modern era. And, you know, going back, Deviance has a slow, menacing feel to it. You know, that clean part at the beginning is creepy as fuck with, like, the, you know, explosions going off and the screams. And, you know, I know it's kind of... It seemed like an odd choice to use the same scream, like, 4 times.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, is this person just, like, respawning in a game and keeps getting killed? And they only had, like, 1 sound effect for that person. But yeah, and then I do detect, you know, you were saying about Slipknot a little bit earlier. I did detect a little bit of Slipknot influence about halfway into Warzone. If you listen to those drum fills in that, like, kind of break section, they're very Joey Jordison in their style. But that really is the only, you know, besides maybe the tuned down element and maybe some of the riffs, that really is the only Slipknot-esque thing I could pick up on.
I mean, but to be fair though, if back in the day, even now, somebody who's really into Slipknot, if they were like, where should I start with Slayer? I'd probably be like, well, God Hates Us All. If you're into Slipknot, start with. It almost seems like they go very well together, even though God Hates Us All it's still a Slayer album and has a lot of those Slayer elements. It seems to fit in perfectly with what Slipknot were doing.
Well, it's just got that, you know, late 90s, early noughties heaviness where it needs to be for that style, and I think they definitely adapted extremely well with this record to the times.
Yeah.
And then you've got you know, Here Comes the Pain, another one of those groovy tracks, and then, like you say, Payback. What a fucking album closer. I know that there's a few more tracks on, like, certain other versions, but this would be like the main album closer, wouldn't it?
Yep.
Apart from, like, bonus tracks. So to sum this one up in a sentence, this is the best modern Slayer album in my opinion. And it feels weird referring to something from 2001 as modern at this point, being as we're nearly 20 years removed from that. But I had a little interesting idea here to ask you, when would you say modern metal began? Because I tend to think, you know, like I was saying with the production shift of Divine Intervention, I would say probably around about 94 with like Korn's first album and Machine Head's Burn My Eyes. They definitely signal a definitive shift in focus to more of a low end oriented groove kind of thing. I mean, I know Pantera was doing it, but they still had a bit of an old school feel.
Yeah, I really do. I probably could hear, you know, many different perspectives on this, and I would think that they were all probably correct. But to me, I don't think it was until the first Slipknot album in the late 90s, because even Korn and all of those bands, you listen to it and it still seems a bit removed from what you would traditionally call metal, even though it's heavy and it has elements of metal. I think that's what in my memory, when the first Slipknot album came out, the thing that set them apart and made them an interesting band to me was the fact that they seemed like metal, but they also seemed like they could play shows with Korn. So before that, all the bands were more doing it was almost like they were more akin to hip hop music with guitars than they were to metal. And so finally, because like when was Lamb of God's first album?
Oh, you're talking...
Was that also late 90s too, or was that early 2000s?
Because weren't they Burn the Priest before they were Lamb of God?
They may have been late 90s, but it seemed like all of those things were happening around the same time, where you had these bands that had modern elements taken from, I guess, what the new metal guys were doing, but they were making what I would consider metal. And so that's where I think it started. And that's why I think God Hates Us All fits right in, because it sounds like modern metal, but I don't know. It's very weird to think about it, because as you brought up, it's been 20 years. I mean, it's been 21 years since the first Slipknot album. Or at least I think it was 99. It was 98 or 99. I don't really remember.
It was 99.
But even I don't think that there's been a radical shift in what's considered metal since then. Because even though you have bands trying to do other things here and there, incorporate electronic elements or dance music into their metal, it all seems like it's all still connected to what started in the early 2000s and late 90s. So I guess it's the same way that you could take thrash metal and say, hey, it started in 1983, but then you could say, oh, it has a lot in common with bands from the late 70s. So you could say that modern metal started in 99 or 2000, but it has a lot in common with Pantera and Korn and those bands. So it's a really interesting thing to discuss, because it is all how you perceive the music, but calling modern metal something that came out in 2001 doesn't sound wrong to me. It still sounds like that's modern, maybe because of the new millennium. Maybe that's why it feels that way.
That's what I tend to go by. Save for like a lot of late 90s stuff. I do think that before we move on to our number 4, is it?
My number 5.
Oh, your number 5, yeah. I think just to wrap up on this little bit, I don't think there is any other decade that is quite split in half as the 90s.
Yeah.
Because, the first 5 years were grunge, and then the next 5 years were... the more modern stuff, what would become to be known as modern. And it's like the production and feel of those grunge albums, only happened a few years before my birth, but they seem so otherworldly and far removed And it's like I've said, like it wasn't until about 93, 94 that we started hearing the production from certain bands that would eventually grow into what we have now.
Yeah.
But there's a major sonic shift in the early to mid 90s for me.
It's a good point, because I guess when it comes to metal in the 80s, it seemed like a gradual thing where it transformed into whatever the late 80s sound would be, but it seems like it still had a lot in common with early 80s, whereas 90s, yeah, it almost seemed like rock and metal. There was one shift, and then all of a sudden there was a second shift. That's interesting. But yeah, so we're on to my number 5 now. This is a long-winded podcast here, which you know what? I had one comment saying they liked the long-winded podcasts, so I'm like, this one's for you, dude.
Hell yeah.
All right, so moving on to my number 5, just like you said, God Hates Us All to you is the best modern Slayer album. Number 5 is my pick for best modern Slayer album, and that is World Painted Blood from 2009.
I feel so bad because like I put World Painted Blood like right at the bottom for me.
Hey, that's all right. So World Painted Blood, for those of you who don't know, was the last album of the classic lineup of Slayer. Last album with Jeff Hanneman before his death. I said deaf. Okay. And the last album with Dave Lombardo on drums before he quit for a second time. And to me, this seems like a classic Slayer album done in the modern era, because it is very thrashy. It almost seems like a cousin, or maybe I don't know, maybe a brother or sister to Seasons in the Abyss, because Seasons in the Abyss was a varied album. There were different kinds of tracks on it, but all of them fast and exciting and heavy. And World Painted Blood is like that. You're not just getting one note with this album. It kind of picks up all of the Slayer elements that you want on an album and puts them in there for you, but it doesn't just do it haphazardly. The songwriting to me is really fucking good. There are memorable tracks where this album is now, 11 years old, and when I first got it in 2009, I thought it was really fucking good, and I listened to it today, and parts of many of the songs will give me that feeling of like, oh shit, yeah, this is that song that does that. And so that's really all you can ask for with an album like this. So we talked about this album obviously last time because was it your dead last album, World Painted Blood?
It was the second last. My last was the Undisputed Attitude.
Oh. Yeah, okay. So, but I remember we talked about Americana, which Americana is one of my favorite Slayer songs, even though you could make the argument that it doesn't sound much like a Slayer song.
Yeah, but I did like that one. That one stood out to me.
So I remember before the album came out, they released that song Hate Worldwide, and it was underwhelming to me because it was so just like, oh, I feel like they've already done this song before. Yeah. And it is probably my least favorite on the album. But when you put everything together, it's just such a well done album. And to me, if this had been the last Slayer album, I feel like it would have been perfect because all the guys are there. The songwriting is top notch. You could make improvements to the production, I guess, but there's something about the rawness of it. It almost has a punky vibe to the sonics of it all, and it just makes it seem more brutal and in your face. So to me, even though we didn't get that, even though there is another Slayer album that I didn't like as much, to me this album is a wonderful swan song for Jeff Hanneman. Yeah, because there's a lot of his songwriting on this shit, and it's just great. Like it's an album that I obviously, because I put it at number 5. It's right here, right next to all of these classic Slayer albums that we'll start ranking once we get through with this one. So that says a lot to me. The fact that not only do I hold it in that regard, but the fact that it still has that same effect over me today. 11 years later, I still think it's a really good album. And Jeff Hanneman is a sorely missed metal guitar player, because I do think that he's, in some ways, like, I think in his death, people started to take a closer look at how he played and what he wrote, and I think that's a great thing. It just sucks that his death had to bring that about, because I think before that he was a little bit overshadowed by Kerry King, and some people would even attribute things that he did to Kerry King, because Kerry King, for the most part, I don't know how many albums it happened on, but it's like the James Hetfield thing, where Kerry King plays all of the rhythm on the albums. Yeah, none of it's Jeff Hanneman. It may be occasionally, but mostly he's just doing his solos. But a lot of the songwriting and riff writing on some of these albums was Jeff Hanneman. Yeah, and the dude fucking ruled. So yeah. At the risk of going on too long about this album, I'm just going to sum it up and just say that I think that it stands up with all of their classic stuff. And so that's why it's here at number 5, World Painted Blood.
I will say as well, like, just to echo what you said, it's not a bad album by any means. I know you love it. And I think the production for me was a little bit of a hurdle. I feel like it feels a little bit compressed and a little bit restrained at times. That could just be a me thing, like you said earlier. But I do definitely. It is a good swan song for Jeff Hanneman, and it sucks that he died. And the way he died, it really sucks. Yeah. And I will admit, like, I've never been crazy about Slayer's leads, but what I will say in the guitar department is when it comes to riffs, they know how to create a mood with what they're doing. Whether it be a frantic, kind of thing, or they really hold back and they play something really dark and awesome, like South of Heaven, for example. Yeah, and really, if you're talking about the big four, Slayer's, when it comes to memorable riffs that you'll sing along to the fucking riff and not the vocals, like, Slayer is the biggest of those 4 bands. Like, yes, like, you think of just a riff that sticks out more than the vocals, that's got to be Slayer out of all of those bands. I would definitely agree with that, because, like, it would be hard to find a single metal fan that didn't know what dun 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 meant. You know? Yeah. But awesome.
Number 4.
Number 4. Okay, so my number 4 is Hallowed.
All right.
So, Hell Awaits. Where do I start? It steps further away from what Show No Mercy borrowed from new wave of British heavy metal, and it just skipped all of the kind of goofy, catchy shit and just went for all of the heavy stuff. And just before we did this podcast, I looked up, because this is, I think, of the classic era, possibly my least listened to album. I have no fucking idea why, because it's one of my favorites, but this is, top 4 territory. And this is a really interesting album, and I saw a little short review of this before I started doing this podcast, and it said something along the lines of death metal began here. And I think there is some real weight to that, because there are a lot of riffs on here that sound like they could be on a Morbid Angel album, or they could be on...
It's so funny that you're saying that, because it wasn't necessarily with Hell Awaits, but especially with Rain and Blood. Like you hear riffs and I'm all like, fucking Morbid Angel lifted that.
Yeah.
and they so it's like Slayer is obvious. I mean, it's not a secret that, they influenced those bands, but yes, it's an excellent point, especially when you're comparing it to Morbid Angel and bands like that.
Yeah. And I know Tom Araya once referenced death metal as like Cookie Monster bands in an interview where they were like, "Oh yeah, we're on the bill with a bunch of Cookie Monster bands," and they asked him, "Oh, what do you mean?" And he just blurts out, "Cookie." But I think he's got some prototype death growl shit on this one, especially on the title track, which I will get into now, and it's also interesting to note that from a track perspective, this album has the least tracks of any main Slayer studio album, but that doesn't make it the shortest by any means, because this album contains many of Slayer's longest songs, most being around or exceeding the 5 to 6 minute mark, and the majority of Slayer songs, like before and since, have all been in the kind of 2, 3, maybe 4 minute ballpark, with notable exceptions here and there with like Seasons in the Abyss and whatnot. But this album really explores its tracks, obviously beginning with that backmasked like Join Us thing, which must have scared the shit out of anyone listening to it in 1985. The opening title track shows that the band took the most evil sounding shit from the first album, ditched all the goofy Maiden tropes, not calling Maiden goofy, but by Slayer standards, Slayer are a very much more serious and dark kind of affair. So they ditched all of like the cheesy metal stuff and just went full on brutal thrash. Also, Tom yelling the lyrics in this song sounds like he didn't realize how many syllables are in the lyrics he'd written, and he had to catch up with the song in the vocal booth. Like I love it. It makes me laugh, but it's just that when it stops and it's like, I don't know the lyrics, so I'm just going to have to say a bunch of gibberish, and it's like such a chaotic, awesome way to open an album, because it completely, Show No Mercy has its moments, but it's still a very light album in comparison to their later work. And Kill Again, further cements a more brutal sound in the band. Gone is the goofy eyeliner, we're just here to kill. At Dawn They Sleep is one of the earliest examples of the really, really evil sounding, slower stuff that they would explore on South of Heaven and Seasons in the Abyss. And the lyric, blood-sucking creatures of the night, is also 80s metal gold. I think that's possibly a highlight, definitely a highlight on the album for me. Praise of Death cranks up the tempo for this onslaught of classic 80s thrash brutality. Necrophiliac has a badass riff and then another one in the breakdown, and I think it's important to note as well, a lot of these song titles are very death metal. Kill Again, Praise of Death, Necrophiliac. This is like leagues above stuff like 2 Minutes to Midnight and Breaking the Law. This isn't just hey, turn that music down. It's, I don't want you listening to this stuff. And then Crypts of Eternity, probably the closest to Show No Mercy, but even this is incredibly heavier than the previous album. And then finally, an interesting thing to note here is Hardening of the Arteries goes that full pelt thrash Slayer mode for that first 2 minutes, and then bookends the album with a reprise of the Hell Awaits intro, which I think is a really cool way to end the album. Almost,
yeah, I agree.
Almost symbolizing this eternity of hell, you know, and that's a little poetic thing I dug into there. I don't usually pick up on that kind of stuff, but I think bookending the album with the way it started and then fading out that same intro at the end, it's frightening, you know. It's almost like the songs in this album are doomed to repeat forever, and they're all in like some kind of hell themselves, you know. And I love.
It's also just like it's a weird sort of like call to just flip the record over and start it all again. Like, you know, just listen to this one again.
Like I loved revisiting this record, as I have neglected it terribly. It's way cooler than I remember. I love it. It's what moved God Hates Us All down a spot, because God Hates Us All was above it, but then I kind of unfairly lumped this one into the same camp as Show No Mercy, when in actual fact they're very different records. And I think it's very easy for people to think, oh, Slayer, start with Rain and Blood and then go from there. When in actual fact, the first two albums are fucking rad too.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, Hell Awaits is an album that I have only like really tapped into properly recently, and I've actually been listening to this one a lot more, and I'm really impressed with it, and I can't believe it's taken this long to set in. But there is this strange maturity for such an early record, and I think it kind of lines up with, you know, how I said Show No Mercy is a lot like Kill 'Em All. This one is a lot like Ride the Lightning, but in a sense that they refined their sound further and did the best parts that made the last album great better and focused on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my take.
I agree with much of what you're saying. In fact, my number 4 is also Hell Awaits.
Sweet.
And if I'm keeping track of things correctly, you and I have the same top 4. We just don't know if we're in the same order or not.
Yeah,
now.
This is going to be an interesting segment.
So I second a lot of what you said. I can't add a lot to it. It is their second album, and to me, it really does solidify who Slayer are. It's the beginning of real Slayer for me. Whereas you had some real Slayer tracks on the first album and EP, but
yeah.
This is the first one where I'm all like, this is the beginning of full-on Slayer mode, and it's just classic. There's just so many classic songs. You named them, just starting off with Hell Awaits, into Kill Again, into At Dawn They Sleep. That 3-song grouping right there is just so fucking great that I almost don't need the rest of the album because it's that good.
Yeah.
Tons of memorable riffs. They got the memorable Slayer riff thing really kicking into gear on this, and it's an overall improvement in songwriting from the first album. It's very focused. It's a cohesive album, I guess, driven home by the fact that it does have the book ending of the riffs. It just feels like they got their shit together big time.
Yeah.
And figured out who they were as a band. And it comes across in this album. I think it unfortunately does get overshadowed by other albums by Slayer, and so I guess that's why you don't hear about it as much. But I don't know. I feel like it's undeniable just listening to, you know, the title track.
Yeah,
it's classic status, and it still does have kind of an 80s production style to it. It's before they really got with the sort of punchy in-your-face production with Rain and Blood. But this one also noteworthy for you can hear the bass on it.
Yes.
It's not as prominent as it is on Show No Mercy, but you can hear the low end really well on this album. Which brings me to an interesting thing that I never noticed until this last time that I listened to it. There's a midsection on Crypts of Eternity that's a very cool midsection, but you clearly hear Tom Araya fuck up on the bass guitar. You hear him do a stop that doesn't happen until the next 4 bars or whatever. And then you hear it happen again. And I go, oh, he was confused about where he was. I went back and listened to it like 3 times. I was like, there's no other reason why the bass guitar would cut out at that one part, except for he thought it was the next run through of that riff.
You know, I think I know what you're talking about, because I think I heard something, but I didn't take any notice of it. But yeah.
It's interesting. And so like there's a part of me that goes, maybe that's why they started turning down his bass in the mix. But I mean, obviously it wasn't a big enough deal that maybe they didn't have the time to go back, or maybe they were just like, fuck it sounds fine. It doesn't take away from the album at all. I like finding little nuggets like that inside of albums of like, oh, like you'd like in on Kill 'Em All, where there's I think it's on Phantom Lord or one of those where Kirk flubs a solo that he hits the wrong note, and I'm all like, I love that. I don't want them to ever go back and change that. I love that.
There's a guy called I think he's Ukrainian. He's a YouTuber. He does a lot of videos about like facts about Metallica and stuff. I think he's called like Andrei Vasilenko or something. It's but if you type in like 36 crazy Metallica facts or something, he'll pop up. And he did a video where he showed like stuff buried in the vocal mix of the first like kind of 3 Metallica albums. And I know this is a Slayer episode, but this is something cool for the listeners to check out. The amount of burps that are hidden on the album that they added to give like vocals extra punch-in sections. They would like burp underneath the vocals.
That is awesome.
In certain sections, yeah. There's I think as well in the bass to Master of Puppets, that dun 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 dun. Cliff is actually playing a note not wrong but dissonant. So it's like one note off, and instead of dun 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 dun, it's like dun 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 dun. And it's that little dissonance that you don't even notice that makes it sound that much heavier. And there's so much cool shit on this guy's channel. I think there's like a keyboard buried very quietly in Fade to Black's vocal track for James to stay on pitch as well. And that's
interesting.
Yeah. And I
love that kind of shit.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. You know, for all we know, as of Rain and Blood, you know, Tom could have like been sliding the bass around on his ass, and like we wouldn't know. But yeah. So that's really all I have about Hell Awaits. You hit all the important marks there. It's a fucking classic, and it's still very enjoyable today. So here we are. So now we get to find out, like, how do we differ, if at all, on our top 3? So let's get into it. This is going to be really interesting because we've obviously both got the 3 Slayer albums that everyone talks about. So it's, you know, because you got the first 2 records, they kind of get overshadowed, and you know everything after Seasons is like later Slayer. Well, this is the trifecta of albums that are like that when Slayer really hit their stride. So my number 3, this could be controversial, not quite sure, but so my number 3 is Rain and Blood.
Okay. This is getting good. This is good.
So this is 1/3 of the trifecta of landmark thrash albums released in 1986. This is the most extreme of those 3 albums. You know, you got Master of Puppets, you've got Peace Sells, and then you've got Rain and Blood. Rain and Blood is leagues above in terms of extremity, and Slayer really opened the doors for the like crazier, more extreme metal that would follow it with this one. It's less than 30 minutes in length, and I will say that this album does have an element of bookending the record with the 2 best tracks. like, I remember someone did like a bit of an analogy of this album as, okay, so this album goes Angel of Death, Rain and Blood. Whereas, like, they're the two biggest tracks on the album, and one is at the beginning and one is at the end. So I'm gonna go right into the track by track. That's a little.
It's a humorous way to look at it, but he forgot that Jesus Saves is on this album too.
Oh yeah, true. I think it's possibly due to the length of both first and last tracks, and then the rest of the tracks on this album are very straightforward, like, you know, kind of 2 minutes each, with the exception of, you know, like something like Jesus Saves or Criminally Insane. But let's go for it. So,
right.
Angel of Death, iconic song. Needs no introduction. It's flawless, and that is one of the coolest metal riffs of all time.
I'm with you on that. Yeah,
definitely in the top 10. Like, I think when it comes to breakdowns, that blew my mind the first time I heard it. I was like, oh my god, that's cool.
It's breakdowns like that make me mad about more modern bands where their idea of a middle section is just them going dun 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 dun, and I'm just like, okay, guys.
Yeah, it's
you know, you can do more things with your song.
Yeah, I like, you know, I like as well when it takes more of a simplistic, like, backbeat to it, but it's got like a really awesome riff in that kind of space. You know, there's only so many times you can hear chug, 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 chug. That was a little pinch in there just to spice things up, but yeah. So after, you know, following Angel of Death, you got Piece by Piece. That song is a pummeling attack on the ears in the best of ways. You know, only to be followed by Necrophobic, this all-out speedy 100 seconds of, oh, holy fuck.
That's in my top 10 Slayer songs too.
Really?
My top 10 probably is actually 20, I don't know.
And then you've got Altar of Sacrifice as another awesome thrashing track. Although I will say, now, disclaimer, this may ruin this song for you.
All right.
I watched a misheard lyrics video for this song, and there's a part where Tom says, like, answer his every command, but someone had said that someone had put it so it's like, answer his every Timmy, like Timmy from South Park.
Oh, yeah.
And I've never been able to unhear it. In 10 years, I have tried my best, but, like, the more I hone in on it, I think I've just accepted it as part of the album's lexicon. But yeah, and then that song fades out into Jesus Saves. You know, you can really hear what sounds death metal bands would take from this and build upon later in the decade and into the 90s. And then Criminally Insane, iconic drum beat. That
Lombardo
is
beat.
The Lombardo beat, exactly. Insanely good single-handed 16th notes on the ride cymbal. Awesome drumming ability from Dave Lombardo. Reborn shows off Tom's snarly vocals, especially that ripped and torn bit where he really lays into it. Epidemic has a really cool riff around the 30-second mark that I completely forgot about, and when I heard it again, I was like, I feel like I'm hearing this for the first time.
There's a lot of little things in Rain and Blood that if you really get into it, there's so much in this album that sticks out that are the major things that it's sometimes easy to lose these other little cool things that happen on the album. And so, yeah, they're everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, like the pairing of Reborn and Epidemic always struck me as like the hidden gems of this record. And then finally you've got the songs Postmortem and Rain and Blood. which both, you know, it ends this record on an extremely high quality pairing of tracks that just rip you in half, and just the same as the first time you heard them. This album is classic and influential in every way, but is it Slayer's best? Is the question I asked myself.
Yeah.
When I considered the hype surrounding this record, you know, at the time it set a standard. You know, this is how extreme we can really get with this, and it was like, holy shit, you know. Obviously, people who had followed Slayer from the beginning could see this development happening, but if people were listening to more stuff like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden, or maybe even Metallica and Megadeth, because Metallica and Megadeth, comparatively speaking, are pretty tame compared to Slayer in terms of extremity.
Yeah.
You know, even Metallica's fastest stuff is still much more accessible than a Slayer album.
Totally.
But yeah, that is my pick for number 3.
Okay. Quickly moving on to my number 3, which is not Rain and Blood. My number 3 is the 1988 album South of Heaven.
Yeah, I knew that was going to be the pick. I knew it.
So to be fair, though, we're now getting at a point where, to me, it's 3 pretty fucking perfect albums that we're talking about here. So it's hard to fuck with them. So the South of Heaven is the second one produced by Rick Rubin.
Yeah.
And it followed Rain and Blood, and I think the production on South of Heaven is better than Rain and Blood. It still retains the sort of punchy quality. It still seems very heavy, but something about it where all the instruments really seem to shine through in more of a clear, and you can clearly hear things a lot better, but it still sounds really heavy. And on this one, you can hear at times the bass guitar. But the thing that I noticed going back and listening to a lot of these early albums is that depending on the song, it's almost like if the bass guitar had something prominent that was being played, it was actually turned up louder, and then other times it would be turned down lower. And but for the most part, South of Heaven, I think. I go back and forth on what I think the best produced Slayer album is, and South of Heaven is one of them. And overall, like, this is just a very mature album from a band that gave you a pummeling 29-minute fucking classic right before this, a couple years before this, and I almost feel like they knew that they nailed it with that album. They were like, we already we perfected the fast thing on Rain and Blood, and their confidence shows through in the songwriting on South of Heaven. It just sounds like a band that's like, we got this. We don't need your input. We got this. And there's just so many fucking classic songs on this album. Probably my favorite aspect of this particular album is the fact that this is when Tom Araya starts to add more dynamics to his vocals. He sings parts. He varies up how he does his shouting. Now, there is no high-pitched stuff on this album, but it's almost like every aspect of this album is more mature. Everyone's performances, everything just seems like a band that has settled into their groove so well, and now they just know how to fucking do it. Obviously there are a lot of standout tracks, South of Heaven being one of them, but also, you know, Mandatory Suicide is a fucking killer song.
Hell yeah.
Sure, there are a few that I don't think hit the marks as well as others do, and that's probably why it's here at number 3. But one that I hear people talk shit about that is actually one of my favorites is Dissident Aggressor, which is the most not Slayer sounding song on the album. It is a true oddball on the album, but I think it's fucking great. And it's one of those songs that comes on and I'm just like, this is great. I love that they put this here, and I don't know, it just feels perfect in the album. And then obviously, you know, it wraps up with Spill the Blood, which is a great song, but it is a gripe of mine that Spill the Blood to me isn't the best album closer, especially when you just followed Rain and Blood, which has one of the best album closers on it. Yeah. So it is one of those things where I'm like, it could have been a better song at the end. But overall, I think that even though you hear people talk about South of Heaven as a classic Slayer album, I think it still doesn't get the love that it deserves. I think it's a little bit underrated.
I totally agree.
And I think
completely.
I do hear people talk about how it's not as good because of the slower tempos, but we talked about this before on the last episode. When they slow things down, it makes those fast parts really pop and they're really effective. The same, it's vice versa. The fast parts make those slow parts really shine. And I feel like at this point, this is when they were truly mastering what it was to write a Slayer song, no matter what the tempo was. They now knew how to do it. And Definitely. So, I don't have much more I can add. I feel like we'll get way more in depth with you as we normally do. So, my number 3 is South of Heaven. And it's one of those albums that, you know, it's hard to tell somebody where to start with Slayer. And usually I would say just, you know, start with Rain and Blood and then move forward. Because I do think that after Rain and Blood, you get to hear the growth of Slayer while still making kick-ass music.
Hell yeah. You know, and that's a really good segue because my number 2 pick is South of Heaven.
Nice.
Now, something that would be important to state here is that this was, for the longest time, my favorite Slayer album. This would have been number 1 had I not analyzed it and compared it to what eventually would become number 1, which obviously we've narrowed it down. We know what it is.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it. But
somebody may have just joined the podcast right here and they have no idea.
Yeah. I love that they slowed down on this album. It was actually a tradition of mine during high school that I would usher in the new year with this album, and I would try and time it so that the intro to South of Heaven would be so perfectly timed that when shit gets real and when it goes would come in like right when it strikes midnight.
That's a hell of a tradition. I would like to do that myself.
Yeah, I think I did it for about 3 years straight, probably from about like either 2010 or 2011 to about 13 or 14. And I just remember that being such a defining event during that time. It was like, oh shit, new year, got to put on South of Heaven. You know. And this would have been my top pick until I made this list and really gave it some thought. But anyway, the title track right off the bat is already a massive departure from the speed of Rain and Blood, and that awesome intro, the slower, sinister sound that Slayer has and can break out in the best slow moments they have. I think South of Heaven is the bar. That opening track is how to give the listener goosebumps at the start of a record. That one always never fails to, you know, I know it's an album and I know it can't hurt me, but every single time I listen to that intro, I get kind of scared because I'm thinking, oh shit, this album's called South of Heaven and where I'm going, it ain't good, you know. and it's just that, I cannot put into words the feeling I get whenever I hear that intro, because I just think, oh shit. It's almost like, I've always envisioned it as almost like a roller coaster, and not in the speed department, but that gradually increasing thing. It's almost like you're slowly being taken up to the peak, and then when everyone comes in with that. Oh, it's like going right over that and being thrown into this pit.
I mean, you somebody could argue. I don't know. Like, there's a part of me that I could hold that song as more iconic with Slayer than even Raining Blood. Because it does. It's a vibe and it's a thing. It's a Slayer thing. Like, I don't know. They had that way of crafting those riffs that sounded really evil. Like, oh shit, some shit's about to go down, and there's something to be said about that. Slowing it down makes it seem more eerie, and and that's echoed by the production choices they made on this album. It's like you said, it retains that punch, but it's got more space to play with. Yeah. Because with the slower tempos, the more dry sound isn't going to be as effective. So you need to create a bit of a larger space to play around with. Because, I would liken it to, it's almost like Rain in Blood would be like landing on the beaches of Normandy. You're already being shot at right off the bat, whereas with South of Heaven, you're in this kind of really dark, evil area being hunted by something. It's almost like a lot, kind of to piggyback off what you're saying. It's like if you were choosing ways to die, Rain and Blood is kind of like a horrific car accident where it's like your world is just turned on its ass and everything is upside down and it happens in a flash. And then South of Heaven is like being buried alive. Yeah. It's like, dude. You literally hit the nail on the head. That is the best analogy I've heard for the vibes that Slayer can create. Yeah. And I think there really is something to be said for the way that Slayer chooses to open their records, because you get one or the other. There is no in between. You either get hit in the face or scared shitless. Yeah. And it's one of the two. And Hell Awaits kind of opens the same way with that, like slowly fading in, that like join us kind of thing, and then it gets going. But I just love the fact that this opening track, I love that we're elaborating and this is only the first track. Like this is how much I love this record, and it pained me to have to put it in second, but after some evaluation I had to put the other one above it. We could probably just agree that this is the 3-part number one. Yeah. But yeah, it's just so good. And then when track 1 finishes, they let the guitar feedback ring out, and then it fades into one of the faster tracks on the record, Silent Scream, and that really hits you with the double kick going on. And it's, people always slag this album off for being too slow. I feel like lack a certain maturity in understanding music. Because like, yeah, if you don't like slower, that's fine. If you come to a thrash band wanting speed, I understand that completely. But just sit back with this album for a moment and let it take you somewhere, because even in the slower parts, it's I struggle to think how anyone would not be blown away by this album. Well, if you look at any of the thrash bands from the 80s, not just the big four, but any of them, they had slower elements on certain albums. Sometimes an entire album was a slower turn. And definitely. I think the idea of thrash metal needing to be fast and brutal all the time is, I'm not trying to disparage a generation, but it seems like a millennial thing. Yeah. Where it's like all of a sudden it's like, oh, the people who weren't there seem to think that, oh no, thrash is always, you're supposed to just play fast and aggressive all the time. I'm all like, well, none of the bands did. Yeah. So. Exactly. And I think,
I think what they did with South of Heaven with this album is they wanted to avoid becoming a cliche. You know, which, you know, that they aren't, but, you know, Slayer is the first band people reach for when people say really, really fast metal, you know, because they really did perfect the frantic pace of that whole skank beat kind of thing. But this album, it's not so much a rejection of that as it is a step back, evaluating other vibes. And, you know, obviously with Silent Scream, it's quite a quick song for this album. Very quick, actually, you know. And then Live Undead has a sinister, menacing, slow pace, much like track 1, you know, with that like that's really sitting there on that slow beat, and it's really letting everything breathe. And I feel like that sounds more evil than the fast stuff because, you know, I feel like the fast stuff is like actually doing the killing, while the slow shit is just tormenting whoever's getting it, you know?
Yeah. To be fair though, like with fast riffs, with fast, really cool riffs, even if it's a song that's fast and the riff is played with a fast beat, if somewhere in the song they don't slow the beat down but still play the riff the same way, I feel like I've been shortchanged. I'm just you need to have time to beat but keep the riff going, because that's how you really milk a badass riff to me. It's so Slayer knew how to do that a lot of the times too.
There's a meme I saw on like a metal memes page or something, and it summed that up perfectly. And it just had this photo of that of some guy doing like a real frowny face, like, and it was captioned with when the band stops playing and brings the meaty riff back but slower. Yeah, and it was just that kind of face going on.
Yep. There's something to be said about a good breakdown or a good midsection, or just in the case of some songs like the one we're talking about, where you have a great riff but you don't kill it with a drum beat that plays exactly along with the riff rhythm.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Exactly.
You know, it's good to vary tempo.
Yeah.
For sure. And I think that's like a dynamic thing that some, you know, thrash bands tend to forget about sometimes is that it doesn't need to be all the time. You know, I just love when bands that are known for being fast play slow shit and slay it.
Yep.
Which is probably why they're called Slayer.
Because that's what they do.
Yeah. And then Behind the Crooked Cross. Try saying that really fast. Behind the Crooked Cross.
Behind the Crooked Cross. Yeah, it is. It's a little bit of a tongue twister.
Yeah. Behind the Behind the Caca for Cocoa Puffs has a catchy, chuggy feel. I think is that song Downpicks? Or is that alternate? I can't remember.
It has to be downpicked.
Yeah.
I'd have to hear it right now, but it just feels to me like it's a downpicked song.
Yeah, I just fucking love it when stuff like that happens. You know, when you break out the downpicks, so good. Premium chugging, I love it very much. Mandatory Suicide, as you touched on previously, one of my favorite Slayer tracks. This has everything I love in a Slayer song, and that like kind of fucking like reflective war poetry thing at the end, where Tom's just like reciting the lyrics over the top of this chaos at the end. It just really conjures up that feeling of, you know, going over the top of a trench. It really has that, you know, scary, I'm going to die feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those albums that really has the power to scare you shitless if you put yourself in the right mindset.
Absolutely.
And then the song. Now I have a little interesting tidbit about the songs "Ghost of War" and "Read Between the Lies." Now, what I'll say about "Ghost of War," it has an awesome triplet breakdown in the middle. Again, another one of those. This is a very fast song up until that point.
Yeah,
but that really makes the song that much meatier and satisfying to listen to, because you know that you're getting everything you want. And then something that I always thought was odd was that these two songs, tracks 6 and 7, they're paired right next to each other. They both have a very similar riff in them, and I don't know if you've noticed this.
Yeah.
But you know the bit where it goes, it does it in a slightly different key, slightly differently as like the main riff in the next one. And I always thought, was that like a recycled riff and they just couldn't be bothered to hide it?
I don't know. For some reason, in listening to the album, it almost feels like it's the what do you call that? A reemergence of a theme, or when like in classical music,
a light motif.
But it's one of those things where like I don't know if that was their intention, but it never came across to me as the same. It almost felt like it was just sort of a similar vibe, but now that you're mentioning it, I bet if I went back and listened to it, I could pick it out and be like, okay, I see what they did there. They had two different versions of a similar riff and threw them in two different songs.
And put them right next to each other, shamelessly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do love this album. Don't get me wrong. That's not me dogging it in any way. It's just, that was a weird little thing I noticed. And it's always been on my mind whenever I hit that part of the album. But yeah, and then you've got a song like Cleanse the Soul. Cleanse the Soul is I was hazard to say it's the fastest song on the album. It's like probably the closest thing to the previous record on here. And then you've got the Judas Priest cover, Dissident Aggressor. And again, like you say, it's a side of Slayer we don't see very often. And it kind of harkens back to the feeling you kind of get from songs like the Antichrist from their first album, where it has that more of a classic late 70s, early 80s metal kind of feel to it, or at least to me.
I don't know why it feels perfect on the album though. It's just it's clearly the oddball, but I don't know why. It always just strikes me as that it doesn't even register as a cover anymore.
Yeah. So. I remember when I first heard it, I did register it. It's like I didn't know it was a cover until I heard the Judas Priest version about a year later. And I always just thought, was this an attempt to, was this an experiment on this kind of experimental album? Because I know that the song structures and stuff and things are very, not so much straightforward, but it's got a structure. The songs are songs, but it's like you say, it does stand out, but fits in the weirdest way.
Yeah.
And then finally closing out with Spill the Blood. I feel like this song in the riff has a similar element to the first track, so it's almost kind of like that bookending feel. You got like South of Heaven, and then the riff in Spill the Blood is so it's still got that kind of descending evil kind of thing going on.
Yeah.
And I've always liked Spill the Blood, but I do get what you mean with it not being the strongest album closer. I do get that. I think this album could have benefited from perhaps like a very fast one to kind of surprise you at the end. But I think this here is an amazing record, and it is a perfect Slayer album to me, and that's why it's in the top three zone. And it used to be my number one, but it got beat by one more record only as of recently. So I'm gonna pass this on over to you.
Cool. It was beaten out by my number two, which is Seasons in the Abyss from 1990.
Ooh.
Which is actually the first Slayer album I ever owned. And really I heard Slayer songs prior to this album, but the thing that really brought me on board with the band was seeing the video for War Ensemble on MTV, on Headbangers Ball. That song is just fucking amazing, and it pretty much just drove me to the record store on its own fumes to to buy the album. And so it has a special place in my heart because it is the one that I've had the most time with, and to me it's the best example of them having a varied kind of sound on their album where you get different kinds of songs and shit. And it's produced by Rick Rubin and Andy Wallace. And Andy Wallace is one of those names where you see his name involved with albums in the late 80s and early 90s, and pretty much you can be assured that there's some quality production going on there. The dude fucking ruled, and it sounds good. The album sounds really good. This is the one that I would put neck and neck with South of Heaven for the best sounding Slayer album. But this one does have a lot of those moments where the bass guitar gets swallowed up by everything else, and so that's probably why I would consider Seasons South of Heaven a little bit better. But both sound really fucking good, and I really do think that this album is an improvement from South of Heaven when it comes to songwriting and overall presentation of songs. It just feels like a tightly packed album, even though it's not short and doesn't have a bunch of short songs. Like, it has that same urgency and no bullshit quality that Rain and Blood had, without just being fast and in your face all the fucking time. Yeah. And once again, it's classic era Slayer. And then really the only thing that keeps this album, the big thing that keeps it from being number one for me, even though I love it so much, is the fact that there are songs on the second half that I think are weaker than the first half of the album. I think the first half of the album is pretty fucking tight. And then it gets a little bit sort of, okay, these are good songs. But, once you get to the title track, it really sort of shines a light on, like, oh, the few songs before this were just kind of okay, and now Seasons in the Abyss is this big-ass, amazing song. Once again, another slower tempo song, and a song where Tom Araya is singing melodically over it. And really, I understand, where Slayer went after this album and why they decided to keep things brutal all the time, but I really do wish that they had done more songs like Seasons in the Abyss, because I feel like they pretty much nailed it when it comes to that sort of melodic mid-tempo style that they did. Yeah. And it's fucking great. And it's an album that, just like South of Heaven, sounds like it's from a mature band with a lot of confidence who just know exactly what they're fucking doing. And it was the last one with Dave Lombardo for, what did we say last time? It was like 15 years or something before he came back.
16. Yeah. Or it was between recordings.
Yeah, between recordings. And it's just one of those things where you could draw the line here and say this is the end of the classic Slayer albums, and I wouldn't argue at all. I don't even argue with people that say that they don't like any Slayer albums after Seasons in the Abyss, and I'm like, I guess I totally get it, because they at this point they didn't have a lot further to go with what they were doing. They had kind of mastered it. They'd sort of figured out, we know how to be Slayer, we know how to do all these different style Slayer songs, and we know, I don't know, it just feels like the most when it comes to 1990 had a whole lot of fucking really confident sounding metal albums made.
Yeah.
And Seasons in the Abyss just stands up there with those, where it's just you can't fuck with it. It's a fucking classic. So yeah, my number 2, Seasons in the Abyss.
Awesome. Which leads me perfectly into my number 1.
Yes.
Which is Seasons in the Abyss. You know, these last 2 albums were incredibly hard for me to place.
Same here.
Because I really... I think boiling it down, I had to really, really nitpick the albums to really find a definitive winner.
Uh-huh.
But I came to the conclusion of Seasons in the Abyss as it feels like the best qualities of both the previous records in one place. It has its fast moments and it has its slow moments, and both are done exceptionally well. You know, this album really is the middle ground between its 2 predecessors.
Yeah.
Most of this album, I did notice, is like, I suppose this could apply to a lot of Slayer albums though. Most of this album is like in the same key, but there's enough variation in tempo and feel combined with quality songwriting that it doesn't bother me. I think in college someone said to me something along the lines of like, make sure you don't write all of your songs in like E minor. And it was like, you know, I ruminated on that for years, and I was like, shit, so many of my songs, you know, and that's why I started experimenting with downtuning, because it was the only way to get so many of my songs to sound like they were in different keys, by just changing the tunings, really. But you know, it's just such a good thrash album. You know, War Ensemble, the furious opening track. I actually first heard War Ensemble on Guitar Hero Metallica. They were a guest artist on that game.
Hey, that's a video game that I've played.
Really?
Yeah.
Have you got? I
don't have it anymore, but I had it on. Was it on the Wii? I don't remember. This is right after.
You had it on the Wii?
I don't now, but this was right after it came out. So I don't know what year this was, 2009 or 10 or something like that.
I just thought it was so cool to have a video game where I could play as my favorite band.
Yeah, it was. I'm such a Metallica nerd that I had to get it and play it, and I did. And I didn't master it or anything, but I had a good time with it. But never mind, we're talking about Slayer.
But yeah, War Ensemble, furious, awesome song. Blood Red, track 2. Is the perfect combination of evil and catchy. It's got a real swagger. Spirit in Black. Now, Spirit in Black has what I believe to be the best Slayer solo, because it actually feels like they thought about what was going there. Because like a lot of Slayer solos do tend to strike me as, hey, I'm going to play a bunch of random notes at a really fast tempo in this spot. Now, I know that doesn't apply to all Slayer solos, and I just always felt like in the lead department, Slayer weren't as strong as their peers for writing memorable stuff. It's almost like Slayer solos were a necessity, as like we need this level of chaos to bring a certain feeling to the rest of the song, and I get that.
I feel like it was a choice, because in talking about this album, there's a solo in Seasons in the Abyss that's fucking great, and it's a melodic solo that's written to go with the notes, and it sounds great. So obviously they could do it. I guess they were just like, that's not our thing for the most part.
Yeah, I think, you know, right from the get-go, so many Slayer solos, like,
or in some of them they just make the guitar do like a
and it's like, I just love it when Slayer, like on the rare occasion they break out something really melodic, and that bit in Spirit in Black where it goes like that.
Yeah.
I just, that really took me off guard the first time I heard it, because I was like, I'm listening to Slayer and I can tell what's going on in the solo, and I kind of had to do a double take, because like a characteristic of Slayer's leads is that it is like a wall of notes. It is like, we've managed to fit like 1,000 notes into like a 8-second period.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't take away from, you know, their feel. But then when you get to Expendable Youth, that's another Goosebump song for me. That like thing at the beginning had that real like march rhythm to it, and it just sounded so evil and so menacing. Dead Skin Mask gave me proper like South of Heaven vibes. It had that same kind of, yeah, and like especially the like kid at the end that's like, I don't want to play anymore, Mr. Gain, and I'm like, oh my god, yeah, this is fucked. You know, the first time I heard that, I was actually, you know, I think this album, you know, on the flip side of South of Heaven scared me, this one creeped me out in like the other kind of feeling a little bit dirty after hearing that one, because it's like, ooh, that made me uncomfortable, you know. Yeah. But it's an awesome song.
Now that you're running through all of them, like it's important to point out that all 5 of those songs have different vibes. Like each one has a different kind of rhythm, a different kind of approach to what they're doing. It's literally, they take you on this little journey by starting it off, you know, because this would be side A of the vinyl. So, you know, with War Ensemble, just in your face, aggressive and fast, and then Dead Skin Mask is slowing it down, being really creepy. It's almost just like all of the things that you need. They just hit all the marks in those first 5 songs.
Yeah, and that like dance with the dead in my dreams. It's got to be like one of the coolest things, like one of the coolest vocal moments.
Also, the ending of that song where they leave the feedback going with the note at the end of it.
Yeah,
I always like, that is a creepy ass way to end that song, where it just, I'm like, oh shit, okay.
And then like you get to the point in the album where they're like, okay, we need to break out another quick one, and they do Hallowed Point, which I think, it's the fastest track since the opening song, and you know, provides a gear change from the more mid-pace, slower stuff in between. And then that's juxtaposed once again by Skeletons of Society, which has that catchy slow feel, like
yeah.
And I think, you know, as a vocalist, you know, Tom does shine on this one with his like kind of gravelly but more melodic parts on this, because the parts where he does sing, he adds a real unnerving, unhinged element to it all.
Yeah, I feel like he doesn't get enough credit. Like even on the last album and on the last tour, he sounds fucking great. He brings the Tom Araya shit, and whatever it is he's singing, it sounds believable. Like he knows how to deliver those lyrics and those vocals, and even when he's being melodic, it doesn't sound like it's a weak ass part or anything. It's still sounds either kind of aggressive or kind of creepy or whatever vibe he's going for. And so, and he does it on this album a lot.
And, you know, the way he delivers his vocals, I'm amazed the man can still speak, you know, with the yells and shit that, you know, especially he would pick up on following like Divine Intervention and stuff like that. That's when he really went into like almost the Phil Anselmo arena of just yelling, you know?
Yeah.
And then which one was I at? Sorry, I was at Skeletons of Society.
Temptation or not Temptation?
Oh yeah. I'm on Temptation now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's got one of the sickest breakdowns in metal ever, and I ignored this track for too damn long. I do like these songs, you know. As of re-listening to them, I know that they aren't the most memorable, but in the context of the album, they certainly deliver.
Yeah. I think with this second half of the album, I think it suffers from the fact that it does feel like they're trying to do the same thing all over again with different tracks.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the reason why I feel like some of them are a little bit weaker in the second half.
Yeah, and then you've got Born of Fire, which is your standard Slayer track. You know, it's just fast as fuck. And then they close it with the title track and one of the best metal songs of all time. Yeah. The opening fills over the clean section get a nice little evil grin out of me every time. You know, I remember the first time I ever heard that like ridiculously fast fill that Dave Lombardo manages to pull off, but it doesn't pull away from the song like any other drummer in any other band over that like if anyone else broke out that kind of drum fill, they'd be like, whoa, you're overplaying it there.
Yeah.
But Dave manages to pull it off in this like flawlessly tight, ridiculously fast way.
He's one of those drummers I feel like occasionally he does show off, but I feel like he does it in a very tasteful way.
Yeah. You know? He picks it, he definitely picks his moments, you know. And I think a lot of Slayer isn't necessarily rhythmically challenging so much as it is physically demanding. You know, it's a lot of what Dave Lombardo plays is straight 4/4, but it's the speed at which he does it that, you know, playing like 240 BPM, like just like nearly all the time. Yeah, I know they have other songs, but like on an album like Rain and Blood, for example, or where they've got like a bunch of fast tracks in a row, it is mind-blowing to see the man in action.
Yeah. And they do. I have heard it said many times, a band is only as good as their drummer.
Yeah, definitely.
but I guess people could make arguments about Metallica when I bring that up, so never mind.
But yeah, overall, this album has something for every Slayer fan, which is why it makes it my pick for the number one spot. And that is my number one.
And I don't disagree with any of that. It's an amazing album. And I went through what you went through, where I really was having to nitpick and look at these three albums from different angles to kind of figure out, well, where should it go? And and unfortunately in this case, like, it's no surprise that Rain and Blood is my number one, because I think it's a lot of people's number ones, some people's number one metal album, period. So I do run into this a lot, where I find that sometimes iconic albums are iconic albums for a reason. Sometimes albums get a little bit too much credit. There's a lot of those. We could do a top 10 overrated metal albums, but I don't think Rain and Blood is one of them. So this came out in 86, and it's literally 1 year after Hell Awaits. So they had already made the shift to where they have solidified who they are as a band. I think at that point, if you knew you were buying a Slayer album, you were already into the Slayer sound. And this one's the first one produced by Rick Rubin. And it has that crazy, in-your-face, almost dry. It's not totally dry, but it's so pummeling in the way that it's produced that it just sounds like it's bursting out of your fucking headphones or your speakers when you listen to it.
Yeah.
And it's just got classic song after classic song. Like I put down some notes, and eventually my notes were me just writing the titles of songs with exclamation points next to them. So I wrote like Angel of Death, and then I wrote Piece by Piece, Necrophobic, Altar of Sacrifice, Jesus Saves. It's just that on my notes. It's because those songs are just so fucking good. Each one when it starts, I'm just like, ah, shit, yeah. And it's an album. I often reference songs that are so fucking good that you have to crank it up when it comes on. This is an entire album of those. And obviously, this is the most brief and urgent and shortest album. The songs are short for the most part. Overall, like when you think about when this album came out, so this is 1986, and every band from the Big Four put out an album in 1986. And to me, each one of them is a band-defining album. Master of Puppets, Peace Sells But Who's Buying, Among the Living, and this one, and Rain and Blood. Yeah. All of them, that's really the point. Whether you want to argue it's their best albums or not, it seems like the point where those bands were literally like, yeah, we're thrash metal bands, but we are doing our own thing. And that's a thing that I think is lost with a lot of thrash bands today, is that everyone wants to do the same shit. And it's like, no, because the thing that made these bands memorable and made them the Big fucking Four is the fact that they made themselves their own entities. Like you won't mistake a Slayer song for an Anthrax song. There's no fucking way. And some would argue that's because Slayer's much better, but I would disagree. that is for a different podcast. But so this album is like a statement from Slayer. It's like a statement of brutality. They wanted to make the most aggressive in and out, we're gonna fuck your world up and get the fuck out as quickly as possible kind of statement, and they fucking nailed it. And it's just one of those things where if somebody says this is the best thrash metal of all time, I'm not going to argue with them at all, because I'm like, I totally get it. And so it's a
landmark.
Yeah, you have a lot of hype. There's a lot of hype behind this album, but I do think that it's totally warranted. I think that they earned it. And so the fact that it's the definitive Slayer album, you could say it's the definitive Slayer album, the fact that you have that on top of it, but just, I don't know, because obviously I was talking about songs, Raining Blood is an iconic song, and just the fact that it's such a no bullshit album. But on top of that, with its iconic status, it's like one of those things where if you were going to teach a class on thrash metal, and you had to have a chapter that included one Slayer album, you would include this album. It's the only Slayer album to me that earns the word essential. Like if you're into metal and you're into thrash metal and you don't own Rain and Blood, I feel like there's something wrong with you. Yeah. It is an essential album.
Here's my little tidbit. I can confirm that is the first Slayer album I ever bought, because it's an icon, and it is essential, like you say. It was the gateway for me to discover all of the other Slayer albums.
Yeah,
and the things it manages to pull off in such a short time frame is astonishing.
Yeah, and the fact that an album from 1986 still sounds so aggressive and heavy today is also something that sets it apart. But it's I don't know. Once I added up all the positives for this album, and just the fact that sometimes the overwhelming shadow of an album over a genre, you can't ignore it. You can't ignore how important this album is, along with it just being utterly enjoyable the whole fucking way through. So it isn't. Yeah, there are other albums that do have qualities that I think are better than some of the things on Rain and Blood, but as a complete package, I do think that Rain and Blood is one of those things where the strength of the album actually it's beyond Slayer. It's almost like it's so important it doesn't even register as a Slayer album anymore. It's just this really important metal album. An interesting fact about this album that I always like to talk about is that I have a vinyl version, and I don't know about repressings of the vinyl. I don't know. I have a copy from 1986, and the end of Raining Blood has a locked groove at the end of the record. Do you know what that means when a record has a locked groove?
Yeah, when it's stuck on repeat.
So you hear the storm sound, and it just repeats. It doesn't ever end. So if you're not stopping your record, you just keep hearing like forever. It never ends.
That's fucking cool.
And I always thought that like it's so crazy that it's like this 29-minute album, or 28 minutes, I think is what it is. It just gets in your face and pummels you and then fucks off. But the album refuses to go away. It's just like if you fell asleep during this thing when you're playing it on vinyl, you were going to wake up with a storm still happening. It leaves behind this storm cloud that never goes away. So anyway,
it's funny to think about as well. You know, you have those like relaxation CDs where you can buy like 1 hour of Rainstorm. It's so, it's so weird to think that you could actually do that with a Slayer album. You could just chop off like the last part of Rain and Blood, repackage that as like a relaxation tape.
It's a 2-in-1. You get a badass thrash metal album followed by a relaxation nature sounds album. So anyway, awesome. I don't have much more to add. We covered this album a lot, and it's just one of those things where I couldn't deny the weight of the album, and its classic status is well deserved. So that's why my number 1 is Rain and Blood.
Awesome. Fair enough. You know, I straight up said to myself at the beginning, you can't put Rain and Blood any lower than 3, because I just thought, and this is not from like, social pressure or anything like that, or, having to have some kind of credibility. No, it really is just such a fucking good album that it holds up to its icon status.
Yeah.
It's just me personally, I like the slower side of Slayer, so that's why South of Heaven and Seasons in the Abyss beat it out to the 2 and 1 spots.
There's definitely more of a variety on those albums. I'll give them that.
Yeah, and I think it's just the variation in vibes above all else is what won those 2 records for me above Rain and Blood. But those, I think, if I've gathered anything from this particular 2-parter of Cranked and Ranked, is that Hell Awaits is hella underrated, guys.
Yeah.
Holy shit. Hell Awaits is so fucking good. Like, and if it wasn't for the sheer fact that these top 3 albums were so good, Hell Awaits would have been fucking higher.
Yeah.
What an awesome album. And I feel disgusted with myself that I allowed myself to forget about this record for so long. And I have a really cool vinyl of it, like a yellow and red pressing of the vinyl.
Oh, cool.
And I'm definitely going to break that one out at some point this week.
I feel like maybe we can just agree that we had a 3-part number 1 followed by Hell Awaits at number 2.
yeah, that's a fair assessment.
So
awesome.
All right, well there you have it. This one passed the 2-hour mark, I believe.
This was a big boy.
If you hung out for this long, thank you, and we hope you enjoyed it. We're definitely going to get around to doing other thrash metal bands, other heavy bands as well. But I have a feeling we're going to try to vary things up on the next one. So we'll see how that goes. Once again, if you're listening to this on YouTube, first make sure that you go and subscribe to Eddie Sparxx, Sparxx, on YouTube and watch some of his videos. If you're not subscribed to me, do it right now. But yeah, put some comments down below, like, subscribe. If you're into listening to podcasts as podcasts on the go, we are on podcast everywhere you can get a podcast. You can get this. It's under Old Head. The Cranked and Ranked episodes are there. So yeah, with all that thrown out there, once again, thank you very much for listening. We'll be back probably next week with another one. And so, on that note, you want to take us out, Eddie?
Later, dude.